Shalom, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Shema Podcast. My name is Rick, and I will be your host as we begin this new adventure. So, a super brief introduction to me is I'm a Messianic Jewish believer in Christ, married to my wife, Allie, and we have 4 awesome kids together. This podcast is a result of basically my research interest and wanting to provide resources for the Messianic community in whatever way possible. My areas of interest in research include, but are not limited to, Hebrew Bible law, Second Temple period Judaism, Pauline studies, and Greek linguistics, as well as early high Christology, which is just the study of Yeshua, his Jesus, his deity, his nature, etc., and the various and weird points where these things all intersect with each other. Currently a graduate student seeking a master's in biblical studies, and I'll likely be pursuing a PhD pathway in the near future, but we'll see as we get there. At the end of the podcast, you'll also find an outro that mentions the homeless outreach ministry I run, and that's pretty much me. I also enjoy long walks on the beach, and now I'm kidding. That's it. So the goal of this podcast as it stands is to provide expository teaching over a variety of topics within scripture and to just let the podcast organically unfold however it does. I don't necessarily have any exact plans, and each season will try to follow a theme of sorts. And in this first season, we'll be trying to become reoriented with the basic elements of the First Testament, and in the second half of it, we'll move into the Second Testament, carrying these ideas and understandings over into Jesus and the Gospels and how these things are relevant and informative. And we're seeking to provide here a pronomian hermeneutic, so that is regarding the law's continuity with the believer. So I think a good place to start, especially with the abundance of recent research in the area, is to recontextualize and reposition ourselves towards the law, as well as other aspects of the First Testament. By this, I mean the so-called Old Testament. And things like temple, purity and impurity, covenant, etc. And these things will help us come to not only a better understanding of the original context, what they originally were, but also how to contextualize what Jesus, the apostles, and later Paul and other authors, what they do with these themes and these concepts and the laws, etc. So, fittingly, the best place to start on this topic is, well, the Shema, and hence the podcast's name, but for other reasons than that. And given the importance and density of issues here, we'll be splitting this episode into 2 parts. So in the first, we're mainly looking at how we should translate the Shema and various issues with that, which surround it, details and the context, etc. And this may lean a bit more technical, and it might scare people off from the jump, but I promise it's only for the sake of really situating ourselves in a proper place for understanding the Shema. It's such a pivotal and it's a crucial passage across the Testaments, and as such, it really deserves our time and focus. But also understanding how to properly translate and then to understand the Shema is crucial for drawing meaning out from it. We're trying to trace how the Shema and what it expresses is developed throughout the 2 testaments, and essentially we need to cover the hard stuff first so that the easy stuff can come after. Or to put it better, we need to do the legwork so that we can draw out the deeper meaning. We have to dig a little bit so that we can find the proper gems. Most people will probably prefer just jumping to the second part, and that's fine. But properly understand the Shema, especially chapter 6, verse 4, is it's indispensable in understanding the later parts, verses 5 through 9, and how the Shema affects Israelite thought, did throughout the Hebrew Bible, and then subsequently our own. And I think this is the best way forward. And I think it's the most beneficial for everybody, especially with the ground we do have to cover. The next episode will be really cool, and we'll focus on verses 5 through 9 and gather together what we'll learn here. And I'm really excited for that. But this first part is very necessary. So without further ado, so the Shema is found in Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, taking its name from the first Hebrew word there, Shema, and it reads as follows. Hear, Israel, Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh, our God, Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh is one. And you shall love Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh, your God, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all of your will. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall impress them upon your children, shall talk of them when you are in your home, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall serve as symbols on your forehead. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your houses and gates. So, this translation is my own, and we'll get into that a little bit. Most people are familiar with the Shema. They understand its importance, more or less. It's recited morning and evening by Jews to this day. It's recited and said in many Messianic synagogues, and it's basically seen as the creedal statement of Judaism, and not incorrectly so. Its importance, however, it goes well beyond just Judaism. So when Jesus was asked what is the most important command in Mark 12:28, he responds with Shema. And he adds in verse 31 that the second is loving your neighbor as yourself. And here he's quoting Leviticus 19:18. And this connection between those two was not foreign in Second Temple period Judaism, and neither were a lot of things that we find Jesus saying. And we'll get to that eventually. But that Jesus appeals to the Shema as the most important command, it really speaks volumes. And we see this continuity of its central claims and concepts across both testaments. And as we will see, the Shema really echoes and it reverberates throughout the biblical literature. And the themes connected to it start to form the very vocabulary of faith, loyalty, and allegiance to God for his people, Israel, and then it applies to the modern believer as well. So, first, when we talk about the Shema, we have three primary words that we need to explain. The first is rather obvious, Shema. The second is the name of God, Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh. And the third is the word Echad. For the first, Shema, there's some really cool stuff going on here. And namely that the word begins with the Hebrew shin, which with a diacritic mark, a little dot at the top right, it makes the SH sound. It is this second in this sound and letter that one's going to find in Shalom, the Hebrew word for peace and wholeness, Shaddai, a title ascribed to God, and in various other things that many Jewish studies have interesting insights on. And some of them might be a little out there, but they're cool nevertheless. And one will take note that this is the logo for the podcast, the shin. But the very word Shema is important, as it doesn't just mean to hear, but it also means to obey, connotes that, as well as a few other things. So in a way, that the Hebrew idea of Shema is to become embodied by the truth that you hear and to live it out. And the Hebrew language lacks a word then that would translate to something like obey. And though there's some options that are somewhat close, as we'll see over time, this truth though in Shema and this concept, it is echoed throughout the First and the Second Testaments. This hear and this do. So in Deuteronomy 6:4, we don't have, hey Israel, listen. We have Israel hear this, acknowledge this, and live accordingly. The Shema, it's a summons of loyalty to God, and the word's presence speaks to the importance of what is to follow. The second is Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh. And the listener will quickly recognize I prefer not to use a specific name for God, and I prefer just to sound out the four letters of the name. So the idea of a proper name for God has gotten really popular, especially in the last decade or so, and with sacred name things and ideas, and a lot of this is for noble purposes, good intentions, but we really we don't know how to pronounce the name. Yahweh, for example, it's a good scholarly guess. Yehovah confuses the diacritic marks in Nikud imposed on the name for Adonai, and then you have Yahuwah, which is a recent one, and it's simply impossible. Is it expects one to force a sharek, and a kamatz or pata onto the wa or the vav, as most people know, is a wa, and into a guttural he. So, but we won't get into all that. Maybe another day. The point here is simply that while noble and while good these intentions may be, I'll always prefer to say Yod He Wahe, and I'll use Adonai or Hashem simply out of habit, if not simply God or Lord. And here we'll probably use Adonai since we are speaking of the proper name Yod He Wahe specifically. It's a bit easier. But what this does, its presence in the Shema, is it sets apart God as the God. And the Hebrew word Elohim has a diverse background, and it can mean gods or magistrates, judges, and a type of spiritual being. And we might entertain that discussion down the road. It's been fleshed out by a lot of different people and thinkers, especially online recently. But compared to against other gods, whether real and demonic or just simply imagined, Yod-Heh-Wahed is Israel's God, the God, and to be specifically identified here, hence the use of the proper name. So the Shema is also called to identify the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to commit one's allegiance, their believing loyalty to him. And this will be important as we begin to unravel its meaning. The third is the Hebrew word echad. So echad essentially means one. And while many people, especially from a Trinitarian disposition, have argued that it means united plurality and such, that isn't really the point, nor is it a faithful representation of echad's essential semantic meaning. So it's not that the Shema is for or against a Trinitarian perspective. It's just not the focus here, as we'll get into. And people, you're really gonna have to look somewhere else for that idea and that argument. And Ahad firstly means one, as in a choral number, or first, as in an order. But it can be one conceptually, such as Adam and Eve becoming one, or the use of Israel to Samuel, or even in there, it's, we have this idea of alone or uniquely or etc. So Shema and the name are rather straightforward, but Echad really faces us with a translation issue and also translation theory issue, and it needs to be investigated as pretty central to what is actually being expressed here. And beyond just Echad, Deuteronomy 6:4 itself is notoriously difficult to translate, and it's surprising because it's only 6 words. The four of interest, though, are what actually follows Shema Yisrael, and that is the Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. So, as Bill T. Arnold in his NICOT commentary on Deuteronomy says, for a text as important as this one, it may seem puzzling that precision is impossible in English translation, end quote. And then he also adds that despite the varieties of ways to understand this verse, the central theme of Deut 6:4 is nevertheless clear. There is one Yod-Heh-Wahed prescribed for Israel in one Torah. The rest of the book is essentially spelling out the specifics of this reality, end quote. So the interconnectedness of the Shema to its surrounding context is interesting. And here we need to look at what comes before and after the passage, what surrounds it, as in any situation, we can never really just take a verse or a whole section out of its context. Context is always king. But quoting Arnold again, he adds that the Shema stands as a roaring assertion about the essence and nature of Yod-Heh-Wahed. The Shema undergirds the first commandment, 5:7, and sets the ideological fundamentals of Israelite religion, paraphrasing, in fact, all the 10 words and asserting the truth upon which the covenant in the book of Deuteronomy rests, end quote. And this is an important point that a lot of people make. By 10 words, Arnold here refers to the so-called 10 commandments, which is debated because we're not really quite sure how many actual number of imperatives there are, and maybe another time, but these, the Decalogue and the Shema, are linked together thematically and even linguistically in Jewish tradition and the Hebrew Bible. So even in Jerusalem Talmud, for example, in Barakah 1:5a, we see that the rabbis or the sages are ascribing a direct connection between each word of the Shema in each commandment in the Decalogue, the 10 words. And while that's a much later phenomenon, the general idea is quite connected. And that's one of those examples of creative Jewish exegesis, but still insightful a lot of times. And here Arnold also brings up he's bringing up this connection between the Shema, or of the Shema, the idea of the Shema undergirding the first commandment in 5:7, which is not placing any God before or in front of God. And many actually see the Shema echoing this in being the command, the ha-mitzvah of Deuteronomy 6:1, which is a lot of times is considered to actually just stand as representative of the whole law of Moses. But this is an attractive reading, and it could be possible. So the overall issue here isn't really each word, but how to translate them together and to do so exactly. For example, Judah Kraut, who we will return to, he quotes oral in that it is not their meaning or function, but their combination that makes the words of the Shema individually transparent but obscure when put together, end quote. So for one, we have here a verbless clause, potentially two nominal clauses and affixed to one another. And plainly, we would read Adonai God, Adonai one. And here we're neglecting the suffix Eloheinu and just taking the noun Elohim. And this isn't really straightforward. One of the difficulties here is where to put the is or the our, etc., if we should at all. Another is identifying the subject and the predicate, which is really important for both. And we don't necessarily have the same function going on between each of these clauses, separate but interconnected. And here we can present 5 primary translation choices, which are as follows. Adonai our God is one Adonai. Adonai our God, Adonai is one. Adonai is our God, Adonai alone. Adonai is our God, Adonai is one, and our God is Adonai, only Adonai. And there's going to be different ones. There's probably countless at this point, but these are typical renderings, and each have their own set of strengths and weaknesses. And it would certainly be wrong to say if there's any type of real scholarly consensus here. But we will briefly try to get into this a bit. A good way forward that many take is to look at the uses of the words Adonai, the proper name, and Elohim in Deuteronomy, both grammatically and contextually. So in Deuteronomy, which is our literary context here, the two words are connected frequently, but they're usually in verbal clauses and with a provide pronoun for God and a definite article for Elohim, which naturally sets up the syntax for a meaning like Adonai is our God or Adonai is our God, etc. within sentences. So throughout Deuteronomy, we have Elohim in opposition to Adonai rather than as its predicate. Opposition is to say its two words are directly linked together, whereas the predicate is describing. So is Elohim linked to Adonai, or is it describing Adonai? And this is where providing the is comes into play, and it's rather important. So here in Eloheinu, we have the pronominal suffix, which would not have a definite article follow it, which kind of adds a dimension of the argument for either side. And this also has a lot to do with how we read the Adonai Echad. Basically, if we provide is here, not only is the weight of the whole statement on Adonai Eloheinu, but it essentially makes Adonai Echad take on the meaning of alone in Echad, which many argue is not necessarily a faithful rendering of Echad. So additionally, adding the is throws the weight upon Eloheinu, whereas it seems clear that Adonai is the subject in both parts. So it gets tricky, and Deuteronomy does not really provide us with any example of a suffixed Elohim being used as a predicate of Adonai. The simplest solution ultimately is to choose Adonai our God. Not only is this the smoothest reading organically, but it affords more meaning to be placed in Adonai Echad, and it fits perfectly within the general context of Deuteronomy 5:6, and no matter how one wants to interpret that. What comes into play is the central importance of the second part of the Shema clause in Adonai Echad. Removing a subject-predicate idea in Adonai Eloheinu we're more limited in understanding Echad, but not very, as the first part simply states Adonai our God. It presents God. And how we are to understand what follows is then what matters for the clause. And most translations opt for Adonai as one, but one is itself ambiguous and largely context dependent. And some have argued that the translation ought to be is one Adonai, supposing that Adonai here is to be regarded as the only. And mostly it's due to supposed presence of other deities in the ancient Near East, or really Israel, who were called Yod-Heh-Wahe. Examples are the inscriptions found at Kuntele Ajrud of the Yod-Heh-Wahe of Samaria and Yod-Heh-Wahe of Taman. And again, here we're trying to just see different ideas. And now I'm mixing Yod-Heh-Wahe and Adonai, but trying to just emphasize this. But this idea has not really gone accepted or gained popularity, because while the presence of similar or even exact names to the God of the Bible is a separate issue altogether, and one which can immediately be simply coincidence of morphological overlap if others found outside of Israel. But really, there's nothing in Deuteronomy or the Hebrew Bible as a whole that suggests any type of Adonai versus Adonai, or Yod-Heh-Wahe versus Yod-Heh-Wahe, polemic or conflict. A conflict, the same name being applied to different deities. So the inscriptions at Kuntala Ajrud are typically dated to the 8th or 7th, I think 9th, frequently centuries BC. So there's also no argument in respect to the dating on either end. The other significant difficulty here, especially for those who see Echad as referring to God's oneness, as an ontological singularity, like a singular in being, a single being, thus contra Trinitarian ideas, is that in Hebrew, proper names are not modified for adjectives, or at least not normally. So the idea of Adonai our God is a single Adonai, or Adonai is singular, it's not grammatically proper. And this would take Echad as an attributive adjective, which again, it doesn't take Adonai as a proper name, but rather a title. And here it's the person, if we could, of Adonai that is in view. So before we more fully define Echad, syntax is important here. And it assists us with how the clause ends. That is what Echad means. So our earlier mentioned Kraut tackles this uniquely, and this is in his article, Deciphering the Shema, Staircase Parallelism in the Syntax of Deuteronomy 6:4, as published in 2011 in Vetus Testamentum. So Kraut goes over the various difficulties of syntax here, which is how the words are connected and understood in relation to one another in a sentence or clause, etc. And he proposes a solution that I definitely think has some strong points. So just to quote him directly, rather than argue that Deuteronomy B reflects bizarre or unprecedented biblical syntax, I propose instead that the verse be understood as a poetic assertion, or perhaps more precisely, that the verse represents an assertion garbed in poetic syntax, namely in the AB-AC pattern commonly referred to as staircase parallelism. Quote. So Kraut notes that this is also called climactic parallelism, and he makes pretty interesting points in his argument. First, he writes that the second clause of the pattern not only repeats an element of the first clause, but also completes the statement introduced in the first clause, end quote. And he notes that it's kind of an example he appeals to in Exodus 15:6. And he writes, in the pattern AB-AC, AB is an incomplete statement. Only when AC is considered is the complete thought apparent, namely ABC, end quote. So let's simplify this a bit. Essentially, Kraut sees AB-AC present Adonai A, Eloheinu B, Adonai A, Echad C. So AC is explaining more or fully what is present in AB. And what this does is it renders the second A, Adonai, as superfluous, but placed for poetic purposes. And the strength of Kraut's argument is really that this poetic device clears up the ambiguity of the syntax here, which almost every scholar notes. And while one can easily make the case that syntactical ambiguity is intentional, especially in such an important passage, and someone more critical can and reasonably find themselves wanting for clarification. The Kraut points out a couple reasons for suggesting this poetic structure. One of them is that the same phenomenon can be found in Ugaritic literature, which kind of relates to our points earlier on the Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh versus Yod-Heh-Wah-Heh polemic, kind of. And here we have a similar, albeit different, type of like poetic polemics. And he also showed how in Exodus 15:3 and in Hosea 12:6 we find a similar construction, if not the exact, which demonstrates the presence of the phenomenon in the Hebrew Bible. The points I really like is where he argues for the presence of a poetic device here in Deuteronomy 6:4, seeing this staircase parallelism, and quote him, as a formalizing rhetorical, i.e. spoken device, end quote. And that often appears at the beginning of speeches and speech sections, both in the Bible and, for instance, Ugaritic literature. And we'll get into this soon, but basically, Kraut argues that Deuteronomy 6:4 can be seen as employing this as beginning Deuteronomy proper. And as he says, quote, the verse's very poeticness serves to doubly intensify its heightening effect upon the audience, end quote. I dig his ideas, and I think they solve a lot of issues, and it's pretty attractive reading for several different reasons. So, if we were to adopt it, we would then render the clause omitting the second Adonai as simply Adonai our God is one. And Kraut's proposals aren't perfect, obviously, and they can certainly get some backlash on numerous grounds, but it's rather difficult to do so with claiming that poetic devices are being employed. Kind of a lot of rules start getting thrown out. And I think the real argument against his proposals is that they may end up omitting the otherwise and originally important mention of Adonai. So, just saying that Yod-Heh-Wah is meant to be written twice and read twice and heard twice and understood twice. And there's this argument has merit. It really does. Returning to the grammar of Adonai Echad, and what Kraut and others assume is here Adonai Echad is seen as a predicate clause, and thus we supply our is, and that's resulting in Adonai is one. Echad is the predicate of Adonai. And this is attractive, if not necessary, because we need a predicate clause to complete the idea being expressed. You can't just say, Adonai our God. And it accords neatly what we have already gone over with Adonai Eloheinu being translated Adonai our God. Basically, the second clause in Adonai Echad is explaining Adonai, completing the thought, and it's directing the attention on Adonai as the subject. If we were to choose alone or only in other options for Echad, this would be as an adverb, focusing more on the Israelites and not really a statement from God about God, even through Moses. And for some help, we can also look to the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It's quoted throughout the New Testament a lot. It's written somewhere between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. And if taken as authentic, the story of this endeavor is told in a work called the Letter of Aristeas. So in the Greek, we're going to read Akul Israel, Kurios or Theos, Emon Kurios es Estin, which would translate, Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So first we have the Otheos Emon in opposition to Kurios, so the Lord our God. Second, we have Es Estin after Kurios, so the Lord is one. And we mentioned earlier Jesus quoting the Shema, and in Mark's account in 12:29, we read the exact same wording as the Septuagint, which not only was accepted by those whom he was speaking to, we don't see any, hey, that's not the right way to say it, even though a gospel author could have left that out. But this also solidifies the reliability of the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. And this is helpful because in Greek, es is significantly less ambiguous than the Hebrew ahad, just one, but not necessarily without warranted speculation over its precise meaning, figuring out the precision. And in linguistics, we have this idea of conceptual extendedness, which can be perfectly applied here in that a word can vary significantly at its primary, its secondary, and figurative meanings. Essentially, as with all words and lexemes, we cannot simply take ehad as one and therefore define its specific meaning. All words have what is called a semantic range, an assortment of different specific meanings and references, a reference. And underlying this all are concepts that are associated with any or all of them, and these can differ significantly at times. And this is where the problem lies: is it necessitates that we investigate the context, which in linguistic terms falls under pragmatics, basically what the author means to express based on dialogue, discourse, ultimately context. Context is king. We're not just faced with a translation issue, but an interpretation one. And this is where all biblical interpretation gets somewhat tricky. If we take the Septuagint and translate ice as simply one rather than proposal of only or alone, which we have somewhat dismissed so far on different grounds, our endeavor is simplified on the semantic level, the meaning of words, but not necessarily on the conceptual level, if this is making sense. I'm not trying to make this podcast incredibly technical, but these things really are important, and sometimes they're decisive. So we need to revisit ehad and its uses in scripture, especially the context here. And if, for example, the Shema has a monotheistic purpose, that is, of being a claim to monotheism. And this is the position of many. And while many people have spilled a lot of ink on this topic and claim, it's difficult to actually see this being the exact function alone of the Shema in the Hebrew Bible and in later Jewish literature. The question here, which is really a nuance, is if the Shema is saying there is only one God as opposed to polytheism, and thus an apologetic type of statement, or if the idea is expressing the oneness of God for Israel on a larger scale, and this thus being a type of creedal, doctrinal, theological, etc. statement. And again, this is really dependent on nuance or found in nuance, but it is important. So Armin Lange, for example, in a short article titled "The Shema Israel in Second Temple Judaism," and that's published in 2010 in the Journal of Ancient Judaism, follows Keel in that Deuteronomy 6:9 with mezuzahs or mezuzot, which we'll get to soon. It's written and given in the context of religious texts inscribed on and into doorposts of ancient Egyptian temples, and also, which is a true point of the article, that the Shema was used throughout the Second Temple period not for monotheism, rather monolatry. And monolatry simply means what its etymology is, which is a combination of monos, single, or unique, as some would contend, and latreia, which is worship. So worship of only a single deity and naturally as opposed to many. And the idea of how the Bible construes and envisions other gods is a bit ambiguous, but I think the idea of it recognizing other gods indeed existing, but these understood as fallen angels, demons, watchers, etc., it's probably the most correct. And this straddles the fence of divine council worldview ideas, and that's really popularized by the late Michael Heiser in particular. And his view is actually helpful for apologetic purposes as the Judeo-Christian faith. The biblical faith is the only religion to give a plausible explanation for the existence of other faiths and belief systems. Put really simply, they're demons, but another day perhaps. So rather than the monotheism per se, that is the Shema basically saying, hey, it's God is the only God that exists out there. The Shema is limiting proper worship to Adonai alone. It's not that these other gods are gods in the same sense as Adonai, not at all. That's why I tell people be cautious with some of these ideas, and also misunderstanding some of these ideas when they're represented. But that the Bible acknowledges the existence of other beings which are worshipped, literally or polemically, and it simply rejects their authenticity of having any power, any true worth, and there is only one God, and it is Israel's God, Adonai. And this is another piece of the background puzzle here for understanding Ahad, just a piece, really. Understanding Ahad across the landscape of the Hebrew Bible and various themes of Ahad is what is important. As most people know, Ahad doesn't connote explicitly oneness as in singularity. We've already discussed how it's not a proper understanding. So an example can easily be found in Genesis 2:24, where we read that man and woman will leave their parents and become one flesh. Here we read for become or be in one flesh in Hebrew, wehayu, lebesar echad. So we have this idea, this idea concept, and it's obviously a plain and singular meaning of echad, but naturally entails the idea or the concept of unity and unity of two beings. But a lot of people go to this, but this isn't exactly the same as the Shema. First, we have the language of leaving and joining here, and especially the joining, clinging, and wedabak, which gives Ehad such a meaning of unity, unified plurality, and such that people find from Trinitarian arguments. And here we're just entertaining where discussion operates most of the time. But just a few verses earlier in Genesis 2:21, we have God taking one of Adam's ribs, where Ahad is used simply for numerical oneness, singularity. So we can't superimpose a meaning onto words, but we need to look at the surrounding context, how the word's being used, especially alongside others, and especially if these other words have any embedded motion, change, or simply just a verbal nature to them, which would shift our understanding. But an actually helpful parallel for the Shema is found in Zechariah 14:9. Here we read, and Adonai will be king over all the earth. On that day, Adonai will be one, and his name one. And the context here is eschatological. It's describing the end times where God will return to the earth, take his place as king. But this passage really assists us in understanding the Shema. It's actually the closest parallel we have linguistically, where in the second clause we have shall be one in his name. This is looking to the future. So advocates for ontological singularity, as in God's one being, they're in a bit of pickle here, as God obviously isn't waiting for the eschaton to become a singular being. The idea in Zechariah is that God is the only one, the only God to whom worship, acknowledgement, and dominion is or can be ascribed to. He's the only one. But Ahad still retains its meaning of simply one. Another example of this type of one language for Ahad that doesn't mean singular, but specifically means unique or only, is found in Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. And it's chapter 6, verse 9, where, we can read out of the Lexham English Bible. My dove, she is the one, my perfect, she is the only one. Or let's see, NET, but she is unique, my dove, my perfect one. So here we have in the Hebrew, ahat hi yolwanati damati ahat. So ahat is also found in Genesis 2:21. It's just ahad. So this dove, who's compared to multiple women in verse 8, is ahat hi leima, the only one of her mother. And this obviously isn't labeling this dove lady as a single child, an only child, but is expressing the uniqueness and oneness of her to supposedly her lover Solomon, and unique to her mother, unique among her mother's children. And Robert Moberly really highlights this connection here with the link of love, language found immediately after Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4. So he writes here, to say that Yod-Heh-Wahed is one is not to say something about God that is separable from its human counterpart of love, but rather designates Yod-Heh-Wahed as the appropriate recipient of unreserved human love, end quote. And he sees here personal and relational meaning impressing itself upon the Shema, the relationship of undivided individual commitment, which we can ask play reciprocals. We'll see later. It's super cool. Next episode. And thus our meaning of understanding Ahad. And this is interesting. We'll return to Moberly soon, but what we see is that Ahad does not always, and even singularly or alone, have the meaning of one as a monotheistic or an ontologically singular meaning. But it doesn't really depart from that. Again, in nuance, the meaning needs to be extrapolated from, not into, the simple definition of one. So grammatically and semantically, we can mostly come to this understanding of the translation being Adonai as one, as favorable or following Kraut and the whole Shema. Here, Israel, Adonai our God is one. Regardless if we take his proposals for staircase parallelism or not, the first part of the clause is Adonai our God, and the second is thus descriptive. Adonai is one. And again, it's the meaning of Echad is what the meaning of the Shema rests on. And I think it would argue that the best and most cohesive and contextually astute meaning for us is that by one, the Shema has in mind God's exclusivity, him being exclusive to Israel. And therefore, we can understand it as the only one, but retaining just the simplistic one, with the additional meaning here being drawn out of the concept of one. So we're thinking conceptually, and here we certainly have a monotheistic statement in some sense, but in a more relational sense to God from Israel. God is one to you. God, our God, is one. The singularity of God rests in him being the only God, the one God, to whom alone worship and servitude is deserved or permitted. And as many scholars have noted, and we did, this accords neatly with the first commandment of the Decalogue, which is essentially saying this exact thing. So thus we can link the Shema as the addition, the more specific command of the first commandment in the 10 words. And I think this accords if we accept the idea of the Shema being the ha-mitzvah, the commandment for Israel. And there's a lot here, and it really links Deuteronomy chapters 5 and 6 together, and seeing them almost enjoined as two parts of the unfolding discord of Deuteronomy. It's marking the beginning section of Moses' speech to Israel. So in Deuteronomy 5:1, we have another Shema Yisrael, and 5:6, we have the introductory statement to the Decalogue. Here, God describes himself as Anoki Adonai Eloheka. I am Adonai your God, and how he's the one who brought them out of Egypt. So here we have this pronominal suffix Eloheka, and that's in apposition to Adonai. And then he describes the relationship that this denotes. In chapter 5, verse 24, we have the Israelites responding with Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai our God, and this continues and sets the trajectory of this reading for Shema all the way forward. And it's also in verse 27, 32, 33, 6:1, 6:2, and also in 5. But there it is, your God in 6:5, and which does mark the shift in personal focus of the two verses. And all these semantic relational links here suggest that the Shema and therefore our specific meaning of Ahad is about this singularity of God to Israel. Is God one to them? And he is one general, obviously, but the tenure of the Shema has Israel's response uniquely in mind. He's talking to them and responding to them, and this is where the context lies, and I think this is where it's important. So the Shema, therefore, it takes its place not only as a type of theological statement, So a statement about who or what God is, but it also has an ethical and doctrinal one. And so Israel's proper response to God, and even based on the statement of God as one. And this is actually what Moberly contends for, and rendering 6:5 as beginning with so, as in so you shall love your God. And that's based on this second person perfect while consecutive being a Deuteronomic idiom. Sorry. So to explain a bit here, basically a wa or a vav for most people, it's prefixed to words and therefore clauses, etc., denote a different function as a conjunction, and oftentimes it has narrative significance. So in the word we'ahavta, we would read the we here as so, or for that purpose, kind of, which makes sense. And if this is the case, the result response by the Israelite is what follows. And Moberly's larger points in general are insightful because he sees here the latter parts of the Shema depicting this ideal and proper love in response to the oneness of God expressed in 6:4, not only informing the relational nuances here of God being one, two, and for Israel, but informing further, subsequently, the meaning of Ahad. And as we mentioned a bit ago, the love link is important. And as Moberly writes here, what Yod He Wahe is one means must be something that makes appropriate the total and unreserved response of love that is immediately specified. And he adds, the theological affirmation that Yod He Wahe is one is an affirmation intrinsically related to human response in terms of love. So though Moberly doesn't get into this too much or much at all, we almost have a type of nuptial relationship here. God and Israel presented as within a marriage of sorts, which does mirror the covenants pretty well. And we'll cover the covenants in another episode. But the First Testament ascribes to God and Israel's relationship marital language consistently. A particular example is Ezekiel 16:8-21. And another, which to me, it's really sad actually when you read it from God's perspective, if we can even do that, is Jeremiah 2:2, which it really reads as a love poem. I'd actually encourage anyone to read it if they want to cry. Um, so Andre Villeneuve, forgive me. Um, he published a fascinating book on this for those interested. It's titled "Nuptial Symbolism in Second Temple Writings, the New Testament, and Rabbinic Literature: Divine Marriage at Key Moments of Salvation History." And that's part of the Ancient Judaism and Early Christianity series by Brill Publishers, volume 92, and it's published in 2016. He also has a free overview of it on his academia page. No citations or titles or anything, just kind of a overview. It's about 25 pages, I think, and that's pretty cool. We also have a recent PhD dissertation through Liberty University, and that was put up and available online in May of 2025. And that's by Clement Chen, and it's titled "The Nuptial Metaphor from Genesis to Revelation: An Examination of Yahweh's Divine Romance with Israel and Mankind in Scripture." Both these are great resources, and I would really recommend them. But this marriage motif, it does seem to have a part to play in the Shema. I wouldn't press it very far. What I would press is the conceptual layering here and what lies behind Echad, even if only in part, and even if only a small part of it, and moving in the direction of love, where Moberly believes harem commands that are to be understood or taken as a metaphor, well, to quote him, as a metaphor for religious fidelity, which has only two primary practical expressions, neither of which involves the taking of life, end quote. So essentially for Moberly, the harem, which is the prohibiting and committing to destruction, intermarriage, or idols at least committing to, it's seen as a metaphor reflecting this singleness unto God. And he doesn't go so far as to claim this as its sole way to be understood, but not a problem we'll solve here. But the application of metaphor is interesting, as this does neatly fit into Moberly's emphasis on love being a methodology of sorts to understand Echad. And covering the loving God and neighbor, which is echoed later by Jesus, Moberly writes this: confess that Yod He Wahed is one, is to engage with a divine reality whose very recognition entails a total response of the whole person and an uncompromised rejection of possible rivals or alternatives. In my mind, this is deeply insightful and pretty self-evident from the text. Essentially, he believes that Ehad and the meaning of Shema hinges upon what follows, with the emphasis being upon the Israelite devoting themselves wholly to God alone. Maybe holy with an H alone too. um, but looking at this material in 6.5 and circling back to Ehad may be helpful, as both themes or parts of the Shema will naturally resurface throughout the Hebrew Bible. So whatever we decide to do with this consecutive law in 6.5, we read, "You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might." And people, even ancient Jews, have made a lot of these three words. And while this is valid in many regards, it would be inaccurate to impose a Western dualistic body mind dichotomy onto the ancient mind, and which wouldn't really had that worldview. So for the ancient Hebrew, the mind, body, soul, etc., it was an organic and cohesive whole. And we tend to project these later Western mindsets upon the text, but that isn't that it just wasn't there. And that isn't to say these aren't three different aspects of a person, but simply that we shouldn't put too much emphasis on seeing different mental and bodily functions going on, or to extrapolate some obscure teaching from them. So the three words are Livavika, heart, Nafshika, soul or being, and Meodika, strength, or really as an adverb, veriness. So Meodika comes from me'od, which speakers of Hebrew are going to be familiar with. Me'od, very. And this is superlatively the most important, coming last, and it could be seen as summarizing the others or rather emphasizing the others, but it might be emphasizing the idea of action, of doing. And often in Jewish tradition, these three words are linked to the commands which precede. So the commands being on one's heart in verse 6 reflects the levav, heart, the impressing them upon the children, talking of them, the nefesh, the soul, and the walking, rising, sitting, going, the me'od, the doing, or as we sometimes find, the me'od, doing, actually related to verse 8 of them being a sign upon one's hand and foreheads. Here seeing the hand is doing activity, forehead is focus, will, etc. And also writing them on the doors and gates, verse 9. Another way to view this is to see in the nefesh and the me'od is referring to the inner man of a person, with the commanded love being parallel in verse 6 with having these words upon one's heart, to loving God with all of one's heart. And verse 6 is significant on its own, as Deuteronomy 11:18 views the heart as a tablet. And here we are, like the stone tablets of the 10 words, we're inscribing these words onto the tablets of our hearts. The binding of them onto the hands and foreheads echoes Exodus 13:9, where God's own mighty hand delivering Israel from Egypt, memorialized in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It shall be a sign on their hand, a memorial between their eyes. And it even adds in that the Torah of God shall be in our mouth. And this is also likely relevant to mark of the beast and the mark of God being on people's right hands and foreheads in Revelation. So it's kind of dismisses the superficial idea of RFID chips and all that jazz, but the idea of being committed and being marked as committed to God is in view. And we'll cover this later verses in part 2. But the points here are what we consider this presentation of oneness on the Israelites' part. The Israelites, because of the Shema and God being one, are to be one to him too. not only of singular commitment to him as God, but as one cohesive being, all of them being entirely committed in undivided love to him, to their God. Our hearts are to be inscribed with the words of loyalty, the words of the covenant to God, and the entirety of one's self being committed to God is the gist. And that's how the Shema, we will see, is used throughout the scripture, tying together as interrelated Israel's response in the meaning of Ahad. So, some have argued that Deuteronomy is essentially an explanation of these words. And the general theme and concept present in the Shema and the Decalogue, which we've already mentioned, are connected, especially by the first commandment of God being God alone. And this is a neat view. It sees the Shema being the introduction following the Decalogue to Deuteronomy and thus to the Torah as a whole, how Israel is to respond. And what we want to do here is we want to trace oneness language throughout the Hebrew Bible and Jewish literature, illuminating more the meaning of Ahad. And a recent work that does this exceptionally well is Lori A. Barron in her study, The Shema and John's Gospel. So, Barron traces themes and ideas around the Shema throughout the literature, and we'll mostly follow her for this on a bit. An interesting point to both Kraut's staircase parallelism and our idea of Shema being this introductory type of statement is, as she points out, how the Septuagint and the Nash Papyrus adds prefatory remarks before 6:4, and which, as she says in the case of the Nash Papyrus, serves as a liturgical introduction to the Shema, and that this provides support for the idea that the Shema had a liturgical function at an early date, end quote. So, as a liturgical passage, the idea we mentioned earlier, Shema as a type of creed, it starts to take place. And Barron adds that the singular commandment, the Shema, forms the centerpiece of Mosaic legislation and summarize the covenantal obligation of Israel toward Yod Heh, end quote. And so she's noting the centrality of the Shema. And she also adds elsewhere that in Jewish literature, it was evoked as a cipher for covenantal faithfulness. This adds to our creedal or doctrinal statement of the Shema. Where Barron's study is interesting is she traces primary language of oneness throughout her study, seeing that whenever we find this adjective, we are very likely going to discover some type of relationship to the Shema and what is being expressed. And this is really attractive, not only because one, fixed to Adonai is going to identify him as Israel, as the cosmos exclusive God, but also echo the concepts immediately relevant to that. And this approach has complemented her study by paying attention to where love language, particularly the with all your heart and soul, accompanies oneness language. And she demonstrates how this is scattered all about the Hebrew Bible. What we see is that oneness language reverberates all throughout, and it extends into various oneness concepts like God giving Israel one heart and one way in Jeremiah 32:39, and the his name one language in Zechariah 14, which is connoting exclusive presence in the temple and on earth, therefore presenting him as Barron puts it, as the sole cult name invoked by all people, end quote. It's cool because we actually see this kind of bookmarking of God's dealing with Israel between the Shema and Zechariah 14. And this is also potentially interesting given Zechariah makes mention of Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, and the Shema has these connections to unleavened bread we've discussed. So both sides of the calendar on either end, spring and fall. And we find one God, so the mention of one God, El Ehad, as well as Ab Ehad, one Father, so Ehad language, which is found only in Malachi, which is pretty interesting too. And there's actually a cluster of oneness language here, which situates God as Israel's one God, maker, and father who has made, desires, and encourages one family amongst Israel for him. This pattern of oneness. So Barron also investigates Second Temple period literature, where we're also finding the Greek ace language rather than the Hebrew ahad, so we can get a Greek angle to meaning. And that this language is, of course, never used for numerical oneness, nor this idea of explicitly only or alone, but rather as the one. and thus there being only one way, the Jewish way. So for Philo, for example, a contemporary writer with Jesus and Paul, kind of like a Hellenistic Jew philosopher, Philo's a character. Barron writes that he associates God's oneness with God's role as creator, end quote. And for his self origin and existence, him being the one, one alone. And Philo expands the one language as he speaks of there being one temple, one law, one citizenship, etc. And Josephus adopts to some degree as well, another contemporary of a little bit later than Jesus and Paul. But it's still found using one language with God to simply describe God as the only God, and the only God to Israel specifically. So seeing this one theme, we see God positioned as the one. And in the New Testament, we might find some further meaning too, is God is described as one throughout Paul's letters, particularly. And many scholars actually believe that Paul is echoing and loosely quoting directly the Shema in 1 Corinthians 8:6, where we read that there is one God, the Father, and one Lord Jesus Christ. And there's a lot here. It'll consume our time and isn't necessarily my focus. And yet again, maybe for another episode. And those interested should actually, if you want to get a good treatment on this, I'd recommend the book The Shema and the First Commandment in 1 Corinthians by Eric Whaler. And he provides a really great overview of the Shema and 1 Corinthians 8. And we'll probably end up interacting with his work in the next episode. There's a lot of good stuff on this. And he actually has a lot of good material on this oneness theme in the 4th chapter. And he complements Barron's work, or vice versa. And he demonstrates pretty persuasively that one language is applied to both the first commandment in the Decalogue and the Shema, linking exclusive worship and worthy worship to God. All of this meaning and significance encoded into the otherwise simplistic word one. And this naturally flows over into the ideas of one God, one temple, one Torah, one way, etc. And this is what we find in Paul's letters, such as Ephesians 4:4-6, of one body, one spirit, one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and one God and Father of all. So other God plus one language is found throughout Paul, as we mentioned, and it becomes evident that is used in what we can call a more apologetic sense. So Barron adds here, she writes, that Paul's language of theological unity is used in the service of ecclesiological unity, end quote, which is pretty on target in my view. So we see this example in Romans 3:30, where we read that God is one, not a God of only the Jews, but Gentiles also, discussed earlier in Romans and in chapter 3. And he alone will make righteous Jew and Gentile together in faith. Another is found in Galatians 3:20, where we read that an intermediary implies more than one, but God is one. And this verse has eluded scholars forever, and we won't get into much here, but the same idea of Romans is present in that God is one, and this somehow means that he is God to Gentiles as well. There's this type of programmatic sense at play, and here Paul is really echoing Philo's use of oneness language. And Barron, following Richard Hayes, probably hits the nail on its head. And she quotes Hayes in Have We Found Abraham? Says, because God is one, he must justify Gentiles in the same way that he justifies Jews, end quote. And she adds, the Shema is thus at the heart of Paul's case for justification of both Jew and Gentile by faith. So these links might not help us much, but what we're trying to do is join the expansion of themes related to Shema back to it, hopefully to find some meaning in Had, and what we can at least gain, especially with the use of the Shema in the Gospels. For instance, James using the expression God is one in 2:19. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. It is this overarching idea of singularity in worship, salvation, authority, and these all held by and found in God. So let's get back to Deuteronomy summarize what we found and propose some type of working translation. So, looking at the Hebrew, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, we would ideally translate this as Adonai our God, Adonai is one. Or Yod He Wahed our God, Yod He Wahed is one. So taking the first part, Adonai Eloheinu, is placing Adonai and Eloheinu in opposition, setting up the relationship between God and Israel that the Shema opens with. We have Adonai our God. We move into the second, Adonai Echad, and here we're going to opt for a translation of Adonai is one, here being the predicate. And this is ideal. It sticks with the use of Echad most common and intrinsic to it, and neatly fits with other passages of a similar language, similar nature, such as Deuteronomy 7:9. There we read, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God," which it isn't the same, but it seems to mirror the Shema quite well. Hear Israel, therefore, the Lord your God. As for translations of Adonai Ahad as Adonai alone, this seems attractive, especially as what many have argued for parallelism to other Semitic languages and Akkadian similarities. It just stretches the meaning of Ahad, and one could argue we'd expect something different, such as other passages which use labad, which would mean alone or only. And translators are divided on this, as some say the text would have used, others point out that the adverb labad wouldn't be used in a nominal clause, others showing where it is used, and the discussions go on. But I think our points above take all things into consideration a little bit better. As for one, as in ontological singularity claims, this is highly unlikely, if not impossible. And what we're seeing is indeed one. Adonai is one as the meaning, but this has significant conceptual expansion. And this oneness can therefore indeed accommodate a Trinitarian reading. And this is something Barron argues pretty persuasively for, as Ahad can take on the meaning of unified oneness and such. But I would just say this isn't really the point of the Shema, at least here in Deuteronomy. If Christ takes on the language, which he does, there is a case to be made that he is placing himself within this oneness of the Shema. But again, this doesn't seem to be the point of the Shema here. And those arguments which really dominate this area, they need to be hashed out elsewhere. The point of the Shema, I believe we can surmise, is the theological reality being made known to Israel. That Moses has already beckoned Israel to hear other things, particularly the 10 words, which begins with a statement of God being the only God for Israel, to put no other gods in front of him. And here he's largely reiterating that. But as the command for Israel, the nucleus passage and creedal statement of the Israelite faith. Just as God spoke directly to Israel, giving a decalogue, and this has been repeated in chapter 5, here Moses commits Israel to hearing. And he says, "Hear, Israel, Yod He Wahed, our God. Yod He Wahed is one." And he continues with how to love God, just as the decalogue too. And the Shema, therefore, becomes a microcosm of all the truth entailed in the Torah, calling us not just to keep the Torah, which will come after, but to ground the very obedience of it in a true, committed, just an undivided love for God. Just as in the first and second commands of the Decalogue, God is set apart as the only one to worship and serve, so is he here. Yod He Wahed, our God. And this Yod He Wahed, he is one. He is one to us. He is the one. And by this, the concept and concepts embedded in one that comes out is indeed alone. So it's not alone as apart or different from one, but one is in the unique, incomparable, and truly the one and only God, and really in a kingly way. Yod He Wahed is king, one. And that the Shema's language of Adonai Echad is always found most often polemically not opposed to other gods in an ontological sense, but it's an exclusivity sense, but for his supremacy. And this points us towards this understanding, and it fits well with the whole of Deuteronomy's context, where it itself remains a unique phenomenon. And it sets God as the one Israel is to serve in the midst of a land they will be in, full of other gods, worship programs, and objects there to commit to harem and to serve God alone. So, in the midst of these other gods, the first commandment and the Shema mirror one another. This is what we're kind of arguing for. They set apart God as one, the sole focus of Israel's heart. But I really like Barron's views here of emphasizing God as the covenant giver and king, which, as she writes, provides the royal connotations in the use of Ahad here. And as she says, to quote her, in ancient Near Eastern inscriptions and literature, the language of oneness was used of both kings and gods to connote aloneness, uniqueness, and incomparability. I'd also add that we have the same pattern in Egyptian texts where one is found given to a god to express uniqueness and basically having no second. So we don't need to force this meaning to shift Ahad into being translated alone or unique, as these are simply meanings which sprout out of the concept Ahad describes, the perfections it points to. Here we have God as King, Lord, Creator, Maker, Father, God. One. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So that's it, everyone. That is our episode. It was a little bit long, a little bit technical. Hope not too technical. But next episode, we'll be getting into the other verses. I pray this blesses everyone. I love you all. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you and give you shalom. Amen.